In the 1980s, the quiet streets of Gloucestershire were home to Eunice Spry, a woman regarded by her neighbors as a model of Christian virtue. She presented herself as a selfless community figure, opening her doors to children the foster system struggled to place. Spry's household was a complex mix of her own biological and adopted children, alongside 3 foster children who were particularly vulnerable: Victoria, Aloma, and Christopher. This image of the perfect home lasted until 2005. At 18 years old, Victoria Spry finally confided in a local family she had been babysitting for, revealing the scars and bruises she had hidden for nearly 2 decades. Her confession described 19 years of torture at what she called the torture farm. She spoke of being beaten with metal bars, forced to eat lard and rat excrement, and having sticks shoved down her throat whenever she cried out. These details immediately raised a difficult question. How did a state-sanctioned foster parent operate with such cruelty for 19 years without a single intervention? The timeline suggests a total breakdown in the oversight meant to protect these children. Spry maintained her hold through a calculated policy of isolation. She moved the family to a remote farm and pulled the children out of school to prevent teachers from seeing their injuries, effectively removing them from the sight of the authorities. She further isolated the children psychologically by manipulating her strict religious standing. Using her authority as a Jehovah's Witness, she convinced the foster children they were possessed by the devil and were inherently evil offspring. This narrative turned her violence into a form of cleansing. Punishments like starvation or forcing objects down their throats were framed not as abuse, but as a necessary religious duty to drive out their demons. To enforce obedience, Spry used bizarre and exhausting physical punishments. One common tactic was the invisible chair, where the children were forced to maintain a squatting position for hours until their legs failed, after which they were beaten for collapsing. The violence reached a peak during what Christopher described as the van incident. Spry tied a rope from the back of her transit van to Christopher's ankle and accelerated, dragging him across 13 acres of a plowed field until he repeatedly lost consciousness. For children who had been in Spry's care since infancy, this terror became the new normal. Without any memory of maternal love, they became docile, accepting this horrific treatment because they had no external frame of reference for a healthy life. The goal of this escalating sadism was to shatter their sibling bond. By keeping them in a state of constant fear and unending hunger, Spry replaced their individual will with a requirement for total submission. In 2000, a massive multi-car pileup on the M5 motorway killed 2 of Spry's favored children. Victoria survived the crash, but was left with broken limbs and severe internal injuries. Spry used the tragedy to exert a new form of physical imprisonment. Although doctors stated Victoria should have been walking within months, Spry forced her to remain in a wheelchair for 4 years. To keep her in the chair, Spry ripped the metal plates off the wheelchair and slammed them into Victoria's shins whenever she tried to stand. This confinement was driven by greed. Spry wanted to maximize insurance payouts by portraying Victoria as permanently disabled, turning a medical recovery into a 4-year extension of Victoria's captivity. The cycle began to break when Victoria took a babysitting job at age 18. For the first time, she was permitted to enter the home of a normal family and observe their daily lives. Witnessing parents treat their children with respect provided an external baseline that shattered Victoria's conditioning. She realized for the first time that children were allowed to have their own opinions and choices. This realization led Victoria to confess to the family she worked for. They immediately sheltered her and contacted the police, leading to a raid on the farm and Spry's arrest. In a final attempt to stop the prosecution, Spry told Victoria, "I love you," for the first time in 19 years. It was a calculated move to trigger guilt and prevent her testimony, but Victoria rejected the manipulation and stood her ground in court. In 2007, Eunice Spry was convicted of 26 charges and sentenced to 14 years in prison. The Gloucestershire Safeguarding Children's Board subsequently issued a formal apology, acknowledging the systemic communication failures that allowed the abuse to continue for 2 decades. Victoria spent the rest of her life working with social services to help them recognize the signs of hidden abuse. She transformed the tragedy of her childhood into a mission to protect the next generation, proving that survival means more than just leaving the farm. It means dismantling the mental prison left behind.